Hello everyone, welcome to DEEPSIGHT. The recorded history of known civilizations can be traced back at most a few thousand years, while the Earth has existed for 4.5 billion years. This vast time span makes us wonder, were there other civilizations in earlier periods? Although we haven't found conclusive evidence yet, some mysterious ruins and phenomena have sparked endless speculation. First of all, some inexplicable ruins discovered in archaeology suggest the possible existence of earlier civilizations. For example, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey was built about 12,000 years ago, thousands of years earlier than the known earliest civilizations. Its construction techniques are complex, and the stones are carved with exquisite animal patterns, indicating that humans at that time might have had a highly organized social structure and technological level. In addition, the Nazca lines in Peru are huge ground patterns that can only be seen in their entirety from high altitude. This makes people wonder whether the ancient humans mastered some kind of flight technology, or whether these patterns were designed for some unknown observers. Secondly, some puzzling abnormal phenomena have also been found in geology and paleontology. For instance, in the Ottosdal area of South Africa, metal spheres called Klerksdorp spheres were discovered, dating back to 2.8 billion years ago. These spheres have extremely regular shapes and structures, and do not seem to be naturally formed. Some people speculate that they might be the remains of an ancient civilization. Moreover, an ancient iron pillar, the Delhi Iron Pillar, found in Delhi, India, is more than 1,600 years old, but it shows almost no signs of rust. This metallurgical technology is amazing even today. There is also a possibility that the traces of civilization have been completely erased by the Earth's geological activities. The Earth has experienced many large-scale natural events such as ice ages, plate movements, volcanic eruptions, and asteroid impacts, all of which could have destroyed the ruins of a civilization. For example, the legendary Atlantis civilization. Although no conclusive evidence has been found, many scholars believe that if it did exist, it might have been submerged by the sea or destroyed by an earthquake. In addition, the discovery of extreme environment microbial communities in the deep sea and deep within the Earth's crust makes us realize that life might have existed in forms beyond our imagination. For example, microorganisms that survive without relying on sunlight have been found in deep sea hydrothermal vents and rocks thousands of meters underground. These discoveries expand our understanding of the adaptability of life and make us wonder, could there have been a civilization that existed in a completely different way from humans? In conclusion, although we haven't found conclusive evidence to prove the existence of earlier civilizations, the long history of the Earth is filled with countless unsolved mysteries. Perhaps we just haven't discovered their traces yet, or the forms of these civilizations are beyond our cognitive scope. With the progress of technology and the deepening of exploration, we may uncover these mysteries and rewrite the history of the Earth in the future. Today, let's delve into this question. Is human civilization the only civilization in the history of the Earth? The content is very rich, with a large number of knowledge points covering the relationship between history and archaeology, the Earth's multiple extinction events, as well as the emergence of human civilization and the analysis of the possibility of multiple civilizations. After watching the entire video, you will have a clearer understanding of these issues. The basis of historical research mainly relies on archaeological discoveries. History is the record and study of past events, covering various aspects of human social development, including politics, economy, culture, and technology. Archaeology, on the other hand, reconstructs and understands the past through the excavation and study of ancient ruins and relics. For example, in the exploration of the Cambrian period, the two are closely related. From the perspective of archaeology supplementing history, in the study of the Cambrian period, the fossils and ruins discovered by archaeology are the key to understanding the life history of this distant period. The fossils of the Changjiang biota and the Burgess Shale biota have made us aware of the existence of numerous organisms during the Cambrian explosion. These discoveries have greatly enriched the history of Cambrian life evolution. Without these archaeological discoveries, our understanding of Cambrian life would be extremely limited, remaining only in the stage of theoretical speculation. Historical research also provides direction for archaeology. By sorting out the history of the Earth's life evolution, archaeologists can clarify the direction of searching for specific biological fossils in Cambrian strata, determining which regions and types of strata are more likely to contain valuable fossils, improving the efficiency and pertinence of archaeological excavations. History and archaeology verify each other. Historical documents. Although there are no direct written records for the Cambrian period, the general theory of life evolution history can be regarded as a kind of historical cognition, and archaeological discoveries confirm each other. In the study of the Cambrian explosion, the life evolution theory constructed from a historical perspective predicts that there will be a sudden increase in biodiversity in a specific geological period. the large number of Cambrian multicellular organism fossils unearthed by archaeology. Conversely, archaeological discoveries also prompt historical research to revise and improve the life evolution theory. If newly discovered Cambrian fossils have special shapes or characteristics that do not conform to the existing understanding of life evolution history, then the theory needs to be re-examined and adjusted to better explain these archaeological discoveries. History and archaeology jointly promote understanding. The two jointly promote our in-depth understanding of the Cambrian period. Historical research constructs the framework of life evolution from a macroscopic perspective, while archaeology provides specific physical evidence from a microscopic level. Through a continuous combination of historical theories and archaeological discoveries, our understanding of the types, forms, ecological environment, and evolution process of Cambrian organisms is becoming clearer. For example, through the study of different biological fossils in the Cambrian strata, combined with the theory of environmental changes in the Earth's historical period, we can infer the interaction relationship between organisms and the environment at that time, further enriching our understanding of the history of the Cambrian ecosystem. Understanding this logic, we can understand how high the authenticity of the various archaeological and historical conclusions we have drawn is. Perhaps all our discoveries and conclusions are as ignorant as our understanding of the origin of the universe, life, and intelligence. Judging from the geological records, the vast majority of research discoveries on the Earth are after the Cambrian period. The Cambrian period began about 541 million years ago and ended 485 million years ago, lasting about 56 million years. It is the beginning of the Phanerozoic Eon. During this period, the famous Cambrian explosion occurred on the Earth. Before the Cambrian period, the life forms on the Earth were relatively simple, mainly consisting of some single-celled organisms and simple multi-celled organisms. But in the Cambrian period, within a relatively short geological period, a large number of multi-celled organism fossils of different categories suddenly emerged. Almost all the existing animal categories, such as arthropods, brachiopods, chordates, etc., appeared in this period. This phenomenon is called the Cambrian explosion. Trilobites, for example, as one of the most representative animals of the Cambrian period, have their fossils widely distributed in Cambrian strata around the world, with diverse forms, such as the round agnostis trilobites and the long-spined aciphis trilobites. The Chungjiang biota and the Burgess shale biota are important fossil treasures of the Cambrian explosion, preserving a large number of exquisite soft-bodied fossils, providing precious materials for studying the Cambrian life evolution. Let's talk about the Cambrian environment. From the geological environment perspective, during the Cambrian period, the distribution of the Earth's continents was quite different from that of today. The continents were in a separated state, and the ocean area was vast. The shallow sea area was a cradle of life, providing abundant space and diverse ecological niches for the reproduction and evolution of organisms. The ocean chemical conditions at that time were also special. The oxygen content in the seawater gradually increased, providing the necessary conditions for the birth and development of complex life. At the same time, the climate in the Cambrian period was relatively warm, which was also conducive to the diversification of organisms. In the ocean, plankton such as algae multiplied in large numbers, providing the basic energy source for the entire marine ecosystem and supporting a complex food chain, enabling the marine organisms in the Cambrian period to thrive. Unfortunately, even during these 500 million years, the Earth has experienced many large-scale catastrophic events, each of which has had a huge impact on life on the Earth. The most well-known are the 5 mass extinction events. At present, the earliest extinction event discovered by human archaeology can be traced back to about 450 million years ago, the Ordovician-Silurian extinction event. However, the Earth has a history of 4.6 billion years. Judging the occurrence of extinction events based only on the current archaeological discoveries within this long time span is undoubtedly limited. Each mass extinction may have a major destructive impact on the evidence of the previous one. Moreover, restricted by human archaeological capabilities, there may be some traces of extinction events that we have not yet detected. Let's introduce these 5 extinction events next. The Ordovician-Silurian extinction event, about 450 million years ago. Indirect evidence of gamma-ray bursts. Gamma-ray bursts can damage the Earth's ozone layer, exposing the Earth to strong ultraviolet radiation. Archaeological discoveries show that in the strata of this period, the morphology of microbial fossils is abnormal, which may be the result of mutations caused by increased ultraviolet radiation. At the same time, the shells of some marine organism fossils have special erosion marks, which may be related to the harsh environment after the gamma-ray burst. However, these evidences are only indirect speculations, and it is difficult to conclusively prove that the gamma-ray burst is the cause of this extinction event. After all, the abnormal morphology of microbial fossils, and the erosion marks on the shells of marine organism fossils may also be caused by other geological activities or environmental changes, and there are other possible explanations. This makes the accuracy of archaeological conclusions somewhat uncertain. In addition, if there were extinction events before this, the Ordovician, Silurian extinction event was likely to have caused devastating damage to their evidence. Coupled with the limitations of human archaeological technology and means, it may be difficult to find relevant traces even if there were extinction events before. Fossil evidence of species extinction. A large number of marine organism fossils such as trilobites and graptolites decreased sharply in this period and almost disappeared in subsequent strata, indicating that a large-scale species extinction occurred at that time. This evidence is relatively sufficient and can intuitively reflect the sharp reduction in the number and types of organisms, strongly supporting the conclusion of large-scale species extinction. However, for the root cause of the extinction, more research and evidence are needed to determine. Since this is the earliest extinction event discovered by archaeology, the previous geological layers were likely to have been severely transformed in multiple geological changes and this mass extinction, making it difficult to find the evidence of possible extinction events before. The Devonian mass extinction, about 405 to 350 million years ago. Geological evidence of seawater boiling. In the relevant strata in Siberia, strange rock structures have been found. These rocks have the characteristics of being rapidly scoured by high-temperature fluids, which may be the result of a large amount of high-temperature gas ejecting and causing the seawater to boil. Although the discovery of these rock structures provides some clues, the evidence is slightly insufficient to determine that the seawater boiling led to the extinction of organisms. Because these rock characteristics may also be caused by other geological processes, such as local hydrothermal activities or special sedimentary environments, and may not be related to large-scale seawater boiling. Therefore, the reliability of archaeological conclusions needs to be further verified. The Devonian mass extinction was some time after the Ordovician, Silurian extinction event. During this period, there were complex geological changes. Both of these mass extinctions may have reshaped the previous geological evidence, making it difficult for the evidence of earlier extinction events to remain. Human archaeological capabilities are also difficult to break through these obstacles to explore more distant traces. Fossil evidence of biological extinction. Many coral and brachiopod fossils decreased significantly in this period, and the fossils of some previously prosperous fish also decreased sharply, reflecting the collapse of the marine ecosystem. This evidence clearly shows the significant decline in the number of organisms in the Devonian period. However, for the cause of the collapse of the marine ecosystem, seawater boiling is only a speculation, and more research is needed to confirm it. The current archaeological conclusion has certain limitations. Similarly, the drastic changes of the Devonian mass extinction itself may have further erased the traces of previous extinction events, making it difficult for humans to discover those hidden histories through existing archaeological means. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, about 250 million years ago. Geological evidence of volcanic eruptions. Remains of large-scale volcanic eruptions in this period have been found in many places around the world, such as the extensive coverage of basalt and the wide distribution of volcanic ash layers. These volcanic activities released a large amount of carbon dioxide, leading to ocean acidification and climate change. This geological evidence is relatively sufficient. The wide-range discovery around the world increases the credibility of the correlation between volcanic eruptions and this extinction event. However, whether volcanic eruptions are the only cause of this mass extinction, or the interaction relationship between volcanic eruptions and other factors, still needs further in-depth research. The current archaeological conclusion may be too one-sided. From the timeline, when the Permian-Triassic extinction event occurred, the superposition of multiple previous extinction events and geological changes made it increasingly difficult to find the evidence of earlier extinction events. Human archaeological technology also has great limitations when facing such a complex geological history. Evidence of ocean acidification. The calcium carbonate shells of marine organism fossils show dissolution and deformation, which are typical characteristics of ocean acidification. This evidence strongly supports the view of ocean acidification, further strengthening the logical chain that volcanic eruptions led to ocean acidification and thus biological extinction. However, the degree of ocean acidification and its specific impact mechanism on biological extinction still need more data and research to accurately elaborate. There may be imperfections in the details of the archaeological conclusion. Similarly, the drastic changes in the ocean environment caused by the mass extinction not only changed the contemporary ecology, but may also have destroyed the evidence related to extinction events in the previous ocean ecology. It is difficult for human archaeology to break through these layers of obstacles to obtain more comprehensive information. Fossil evidence of biological extinction. Almost all marine organism categories were severely hit, and terrestrial organisms were also greatly affected. The types and quantities of plant fossils decreased significantly, and vertebrate fossils were extremely rare. This evidence fully demonstrates the scale and severity of the biological extinction at the end of the Permian period. However, for the cause of this large-scale extinction event, various factors need to be comprehensively considered. We cannot rely solely on the current archaeological discoveries, and the archaeological conclusion still has room for further improvement. The large scale of the Permian Triassic extinction event has severely damaged the previous geological records and biological remains. Even if there were other extinction events before, it is very difficult for humans to infer from the existing archaeological discoveries. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, about 200 million years ago. Geological clues under unclear causes. Although the cause is unknown, some abnormal element distributions have been found in the strata of this period, such as the abnormal increase in the content of iridium, which may be related to asteroid impacts or large-scale volcanic activities, but it has not been determined yet. These geological clues are very limited and difficult to form a complete chain of evidence to support any hypothesis about the cause of the extinction event. The current archaeological conclusion is basically in the stage of speculation, with great uncertainty and insufficient evidence. After the destruction and geological changes of the previous multiple mass extinctions, by the Triassic-Jurassic period, the evidence of previous extinction events has been scarce. It is even more difficult for human, limited archaeological capabilities to find those traces that may have been erased from the complex geological environment. Fossil evidence of biological extinction. The number of fossils of many marine reptiles, terrestrial amphibians, and early dinosaurs has decreased significantly, and the fossils of some plants that were prosperous in the Triassic period have also decreased significantly. This evidence clearly shows the decline in the types and numbers of organisms. However, due to the lack of a clear cause, the true cause of this extinction event still needs more archaeological discoveries and research to reveal. The current archaeological conclusion lacks sufficient basis. Similarly, the occurrence of the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event itself has further covered up the information of possible previous extinction events. Human archaeology faces many difficulties in exploring these long-ago histories. The Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, about 65 million years ago. Geological evidence of asteroid impacts. At the boundary of the Cretaceous-Paleogene strata in many places around the world, a clay layer rich in iridium has been found, which is an important sign of asteroid impacts. A huge meteorite crater has been found on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, with a diameter of about 180 kilometers, and its formation time is consistent with this extinction event. These pieces of evidence confirm each other, forming a relatively complete chain of evidence, fully supporting the conclusion that the asteroid impact led to this extinction event. Compared with other extinction events, the reliability of this archaeological conclusion is relatively high. However, some scholars still have disputes about the specific process and details of biological extinction after the asteroid impact, believing that there may be other factors acting together, and the archaeological conclusion is not completely flawless. Even so, in this long geological history, multiple mass extinctions have transformed the previous strata and ruins many times. It has become extremely difficult for human archaeology to discover the evidence of more distant extinction events. Even if they exist, they may not be detected due to the limitations of archaeological capabilities. Fossil evidence of biological extinction. Dinosaur fossils almost disappeared in the strata above this period. At the same time, the number of fossils of many marine organisms and terrestrial plants also decreased sharply, showing the large-scale collapse of the ecosystem. This evidence further confirms the occurrence of the extinction event. However, for the specific mechanism of biological extinction and the degree of the role of asteroid impacts, there is still some room for discussion. The archaeological conclusion needs to be further improved in some details. Similarly, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event has also had a certain impact on the previous geological and biological remains, making it difficult for human archaeology to trace earlier extinction events. In summary, although the earliest extinction event discovered by human archaeology is around 450 million years ago, there are likely to be more undiscovered extinction events in the long history of the Earth. Each mass extinction may cause irreparable destruction to the previous evidence, and the limited archaeological capabilities of humans also face numerous difficulties in exploring these long-ago histories. These large-scale disaster events undoubtedly had a devastating impact on the Earth's ecology. Then, before and after these disasters, were there civilizations? Some people believe that there may have been other civilizations on the Earth before human civilization. For example, the legendary Atlantis civilization is said to have had highly developed technology, mastered the control of light, could convert solar energy into energy power, and even had the ability to regenerate the human body, but eventually sank into the sea overnight. There is also the Mayan civilization. They had precise calculations of astronomy and calendars, far exceeding the observational capabilities of humans at that time. Some mysterious prophecies and architectural ruins in their civilization also make people wonder whether they possessed knowledge beyond their time. In addition, the discovery of prehistoric nuclear reactors has also led to speculation about whether there was a highly developed civilization in prehistoric times, although some scientists believe that nuclear chain reactions can occur naturally in uranium isotopes. The determination of the Earth's age. Scientists have determined that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old through a variety of methods. The following are the main bases and methods. 1. Radioactive isotope dating method. By measuring the decay ratios of radioactive isotopes in rocks, such as uranium-238, uranium-235, potassium-40, etc., scientists have calculated that the age of the oldest rocks on Earth is about 4 billion years. 2. Meteorites and the age of the solar system. Meteorites are substances left over from the formation of the solar system, and their age is about 4.5 billion years, which is highly consistent with the age of the Earth. 3. The Earth's formation and evolution model. According to the nebular hypothesis, the Earth and other celestial bodies in the solar system were formed almost at the same time, with a timescale of about 4.5 billion years. 4. Geological records and Earth evolution. The age of the oldest known mineral zircon crystals on Earth is about 4.4 billion years, close to the estimated age of the Earth. 5. Cosmology and stellar evolution. According to the Big Bang Theory, the age of the universe is about 13.8 billion years. The formation of the solar system is part of the evolution of the universe, and the age of the Earth is consistent with the formation time of the solar system. The results obtained by these methods are highly consistent and jointly support the conclusion that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Prehistoric civilizations from a scientific perspective. The current mainstream scientific view holds that although the Earth has experienced many devastating blows, there is no conclusive evidence to prove the repeated occurrence of multiple civilizations. Scientists analyze the evolutionary history of life on Earth through the study of geological fossils. If there were other intelligent civilizations before humans, they would inevitably leave various traces, such as architectural ruins, tools, and writing. These traces would be preserved in the form of geological fossils over a long time. However, no evidence strongly supporting the existence of prehistoric civilizations has been found so far. From the perspective of life evolution, the emergence of humans is the result of a long and complex process of billions of years. From the most primitive anaerobic bacteria, to the release of oxygen by cyanobacteria, the birth of eukaryotes, the emergence of multicellular species, and then to invertebrates, vertebrates, mammals, and finally humans, each step requires almost perfect conditions. The probability of this theoretical possibility occurring may be lower than 1 in trillions. However, science is constantly evolving. With the progress of archaeological technology and the deepening of research, perhaps one day in the future, we will discover more truths about the Earth's history. Maybe there will really be evidence indicating that in the past of the Earth, civilizations emerged and disappeared repeatedly and continuously reincarnated in the face of repeated devastating blows. Archaeological discoveries, and the advancement of ancient civilizations. Judging from archaeological discoveries, the traces left by many ancient civilizations demonstrate their advanced nature beyond imagination. For example, the construction technology of the Egyptian pyramids remains an unsolved mystery to this day. These huge buildings are made of huge stones weighing several tons, or even dozens of tons. Under the extremely limited technical conditions at that time, it is still unknown how the ancient Egyptians completed the mining, transportation, and precise construction. The engineering and technical level demonstrated in this process far exceeds our understanding of that era. Another example is that in the Mesopotamian civilization, the star maps drawn by the Sumerians marked mysterious celestial bodies that are difficult to explain. Their precise records of astronomy and calendars also far surpassed the observational capabilities of humans at that time, seemingly suggesting that they mastered some advanced source of knowledge. In addition, the city of Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley civilization has a rigorous layout, a complete water supply and drainage system, and its scientific planning is amazing. Such urban construction is a miracle at the development level of that time. At the same time, many animals in nature exhibit unique abilities that make humans feel inferior. Bats use ultrasonic positioning to accurately capture prey in the dark. The efficiency and accuracy of this biological sonar system are much higher than the early human positioning technology. Migratory birds can complete migrations of thousands of kilometers, relying on a variety of complex navigation methods, such as the Earth's magnetic field and stars. The complexity of their navigation ability far exceeds the early human nautical navigation technology. Social insects such as ants and bees build complex nests and have a highly organized social division of labor and cooperation model, which also gives humans a new understanding of the wisdom of the biological world. These archaeological discoveries and the abilities of animals have raised doubts about the traditional view of human evolution. If, according to Darwin's theory of evolution, humans evolved gradually from simple organisms, then how can we explain the advanced technologies beyond the times in ancient civilizations? And how can we explain these amazing unique abilities in the animal kingdom? Could it be that humans did not really develop through a long-term evolutionary process? This series of questions, like layers of fog, shroud our understanding of the origin and development of humans, prompting us to constantly reflect and explore to find the truth hidden in the depths of history. The emergence and development of human civilization. Before delving into the origin, development, and inheritance of ancient civilizations, let's first consider an interesting and thought-provoking question. Is our human civilization today really the only civilization in the history of the Earth? With this question in mind, let's embark on this journey of civilization exploration full of surprises and challenges. The emergence of humans. The birth of humans is a long-term process of biological evolution under the action of natural selection and other factors. About 65 million years ago, the extinction of dinosaurs created conditions for the great development of mammals. On the evolutionary branch of primates, after long-term evolution, ancient apes emerged. About 7 million years ago, one branch of ancient apes began to evolve in the direction of humans, and early human ancestors stepped onto the historical stage. Since then, Australopithecus learned to walk upright, liberating their hands and creating conditions for the use of tools. Homo habilis emerged with an increased brain capacity and began to make and use simple stone tools. Homo erectus could make more complex tools, learned to use fire, and migrated out of Africa. Homo sapiens is divided into early Homo sapiens and late Homo sapiens. Late Homo sapiens are basically similar to modern humans in anatomical structure, with higher intelligence, more complex language abilities, and social organization abilities, and gradually developed into modern humans. Reasons for the late emergence of civilization. Humans have gone through a long evolutionary process from the early primitive state to having sufficient intelligence and cognitive abilities to give birth to civilization. In the early days, although the human brain was constantly evolving, the language system was simple, making it difficult to conduct in-depth and complex information exchanges and knowledge inheritances, which greatly restricted the accumulation and development speed of civilization. Moreover, for most of the time of human evolution, people faced great survival pressures and needed to struggle with the harsh natural environment, such as dealing with climate changes, finding food, and avoiding wild beasts. Their main energy was focused on maintaining basic survival, leaving no time to spare for the development of civilization. In addition, the development of civilization is inseparable from the support of technology, and the development of technology is a step-by-step process. From simple stone tool making to agricultural technology, metal smelting technology, etc., each breakthrough requires a long time. When the technological accumulation is insufficient, civilization is difficult to achieve a qualitative leap. The relatively short history of humans. The Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, while humans emerged relatively late, about a few million years ago. Compared with the long history of the Earth, the time of human existence is just a short moment. If the Earth's history is compared to a 24-hour day, humans appeared at about 2359. The age of the universe is about 13.8 billion years. In such a grand time and space scale, human history appears extremely small, and the emergence of human civilization is just a tiny fragment in the process of the universe's evolution. The discussion on whether there are prehistoric civilizations on Earth. At present, although there is no conclusive evidence indicating the existence of other civilizations before humans, from multiple perspectives, this possibility cannot be ruled out. From the perspective of geological and archaeological evidence, geologists study the Earth's strata to understand the Earth's environment and biological evolution in different historical periods. If there were multiple highly developed civilizations and these civilizations had a significant impact on the Earth's environment, such as large-scale urban construction and industrial activities, theoretically, unique traces should be left in the geological layers. However, currently, no large-scale, clearly civilized, characteristic traces that cannot be explained by existing geological processes have been found. Archaeology is an important means to study ancient human civilizations. Archaeological excavations over the years have found that the ruins and relics of ancient civilizations have a relatively clear development context and time sequence, from the primitive Stone Age to the Bronze Age, Iron Age, etc., showing a step-by-step development trend. No large-scale, systematic archaeological evidence that is clearly out of line with the existing civilization development sequence and belongs to an earlier and highly developed civilization has been found. However, there are still many unknown areas on the Earth waiting to be explored, and the possibility of discovering new evidence in the future cannot be completely excluded. From the perspective of technological and resource development, modern civilization follows a certain order and pattern in the utilization of the Earth's resources, from the initial use of stone tools to the later exploitation and processing of metal resources, and then to the utilization of energy sources such as oil and coal, which is a step-by-step development process. If there were multiple previously highly developed civilizations, there should be special signs or unusual resource consumption patterns in resource utilization. But currently, in the study of the Earth's resources, no such situations have been found. The development of technology has logic and inheritance, from simple tool-making to complex electronic technology, aerospace technology, etc., which is a process of gradual accumulation and innovation. Currently, no advanced technology residues or technical clues that go beyond the existing technological development logic cannot be explained by existing scientific theories and obviously belong to earlier civilizations have been found. From the perspective of biology and ecology. From a biological perspective, the biological evolution on Earth is a continuous process, and humans gradually developed along a specific biological evolution path. If there were multiple previously highly developed civilizations, and these civilizations had a significant impact on biological evolution, it should be reflected in the biological, fossil records, and gene research. However, current biological research shows that biological evolution is relatively stable and traceable, and no situation of sudden interruption or abnormal biological evolution due to large-scale civilized activities has been found. The Earth's ecosystem is a complex and stable whole, and organisms and the environment interact and influence each other. If there were multiple cases of civilization destruction, and the destruction of these civilizations had a huge impact on the ecosystem, it would take a long time for the ecosystem to restore balance. However, current research on the ecosystem shows that although the Earth has experienced many major environmental changes and biological extinction events in history, they can all be explained by natural factors, and there is no obvious evidence of long-term ecosystem imbalance and abnormality caused by civilization destruction. However, if a civilization disappeared hundreds of millions of years ago, coupled with the huge natural condition changes on the Earth, it is almost impossible for humans to find its traces. Geological movements such as plate drift, the uplift and collapse of mountains, crustal subsidence and uplift, as well as volcanic activities, will all cause serious damage to the traces of civilization. The erosion of natural forces such as wind, water, ice, and chemical weathering, after hundreds of millions of years of accumulation, will make the physical entities of civilization ruins almost disappear. In addition, if the civilization development level is low and the buildings and tools are mainly made of perishable and decomposable materials such as wood and mud, they will quickly rot and disappear in the natural environment. Even for a highly developed civilization, if it mainly relies on electronic information storage to record knowledge and history, the storage media are also difficult to preserve for hundreds of millions of years. Nevertheless, there are still some special situations in which the traces of civilization may be preserved. For example, if a civilization leaves a large amount of nuclear waste with an extremely long half-life radioactive substance, or large-scale metal building structures are completely preserved under specific geological conditions, these may become clues to discover a civilization that disappeared hundreds of millions of years ago. The origin of civilization, the interweaving and collision of time. Tracing the origin of the world's ancient civilizations is an extremely complex subject. The origin and development timelines of different civilizations are intertwined, and the exchanges and infiltrations between them have never stopped. This makes it extremely difficult to determine an absolutely accurate and uncontroversial time sequence. However, with the help of rich historical materials, archaeological discoveries, and in-depth research by scholars, we can still sort out a valuable general context. In this context, there are also some clues that arouse people's imagination. Mesopotamian civilization. Around 3000 BC, the Mesopotamian civilization emerged first in the fertile plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, being a pioneer of human civilization and opening a new era of human civilization. Here, the earliest cities, writing, and a relatively complete legal system in human history were born. The cuneiform script created by the Sumerians, engraved on clay tablets, recorded the commercial transactions, religious ceremonies, literary works, etc. of that time, providing precious materials for later generations to understand that era. Some records of astronomy and calendars in the Sumerian civilization are extremely accurate, far exceeding the observational capabilities of humans at that time, and even coinciding with some data of modern astronomy. In the star maps drawn by the Sumerians, in addition to common celestial bodies, there are also marked mysterious celestial bodies that are difficult to explain. The reigning times of the early rulers recorded in their king lists are extremely long, beyond modern cognition. Some scholars speculate that these may be related to extraterrestrial civilizations. The Sumerians may have come into contact with extraterrestrial civilizations and obtained knowledge, and even their early rulers may have come from extraterrestrial civilizations. Egyptian civilization. Almost at the same time, the Egyptian civilization thrived on the banks of the Nile River. The regular flooding of the Nile River brought fertile soil to Egypt. The early Egyptians built complex irrigation systems and used the Nile River water for agricultural production, ensuring a good harvest of food. The Egyptian civilization, through early trade and exchanges, deeply influenced the Nubian civilization around it. Egypt is famous for its pyramids, mummies, pharaohs, etc. The construction of the pyramids is a miracle. Their precise geometric structures and huge engineering volumes are quite difficult to complete even with modern technology. Some people conjecture that the construction of the pyramids may have relied on the advanced technology of extraterrestrial civilizations. The ancient Egyptians may have multiplied and developed under the guidance of extraterrestrial civilizations, leaving behind these buildings that transcend the times. Chinese civilization. Around 2000 to 300 BC, Chinese civilization slowly opened its historical curtain on the land of China. From the ancient Yangshao culture and Longshan culture to the establishment of the Xia dynasty, Chinese civilization began its long-term development process. Over thousands of years, Chinese civilization has continuously precipitated and integrated, giving birth to a unique and brilliant culture with Oriental charm. The origin and development of Chinese characters, the birth of Confucianism and Taoism, the invention of silk and porcelain, etc., have all become unique symbols of Chinese civilization. Although there is currently no conclusive evidence indicating that ancient Chinese civilization is related to extraterrestrial civilizations, some ancient legends and mythological stories, such as the South-pointing chariot in the Yellow Emperor's period, whose production principles seem to exceed the conventional cognition at that time, have triggered people's speculation about whether extraterrestrial civilizations participated in the development of early civilizations. Indus Valley Civilization. Around 2500 BC, the Indus Valley Civilization emerged on the Indian subcontinent. The urban planning of the Indus Valley Civilization was very advanced. Taking the city of Mohenjo-Daro as an example, the city layout is rigorous. The streets are arranged in a regular grid pattern, and it has a complete water supply and drainage system, showing a highly developed civilized level. The writing of the Indus Valley Civilization has not been fully deciphered yet, but from the unearthed cultural relics and ruins, we can feel its unique and mysterious historical imprint. Some scholars have found that the layout of some buildings in the Indus Valley Civilization is related to certain astronomical phenomena, and traces similar to nuclear radiation have been found in the ruins, which is quite different from the modern understanding of ancient civilizations. There is a view that these may be the traces left by the activities of extraterrestrial civilizations. Even the humans of the Indus Valley Civilization may be the test subjects of extraterrestrial civilizations and developed a unique civilization under their intervention. Greek civilization. Around 800 BC, the Greek civilization entered its golden age of development. The unique geographical environment of Greece, with many mountains and islands, led to the formation of many city-states. These city-states had their own characteristics in politics, economy, culture, etc., and they competed and communicated with each other. Greece achieved brilliant achievements in mythology, philosophy, drama, architecture, etc., and its unique cultural charm and profound ideological connotations have had a profound impact on later generations. In Greek mythology, the gods are depicted as having extraordinary abilities and wisdom, interfering in human affairs and influencing the development of humans. The Olympus mountain, where the gods are said to live, is enveloped in clouds, like a mysterious extraterrestrial base. The various magical weapons and spells of the gods may be manifestations of the advanced technology of extraterrestrial civilizations. From this perspective, the origin of Greek civilization may have an inextricable connection with extraterrestrial civilizations. It can even be speculated that humans were born and developed under the certain arrangement of extraterrestrial civilizations. Roman civilization. Roman civilization originated in the 8th century BC. Initially, it was just a small city-state on the Italian peninsula. The Romans, with their indomitable spirit and excellent military talent, continuously expanded outward, absorbed the essence of Greek civilization, and innovated and developed it. Eventually, they established a vast empire spanning Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its legal system, architectural style, and military system have had a profound impact on later generations. In some of the architectural ruins of Rome, the composition and characteristics of certain building materials cannot be fully explained to this day. There is a view that these materials may come from extraterrestrial civilizations or be manufactured under the inspiration of extraterrestrial civilization technology. Mayan civilization. As early as around 2000 BC, the Mayan civilization quietly emerged in the tropical rainforests of Central America. The Mayans achieved astonishing achievements in astronomy, mathematics, and calendar. The pyramids, temples, and other buildings they built not only had religious and political significance, but also demonstrated superb architectural skills. The writing of the Mayan civilization is a unique hieroglyphic script, and there are still many difficulties in interpreting it. However, these texts record the history, religion, and social life of the Mayans. The Mayans' precise observation of astronomical phenomena and the formulation of complex calendars far exceeded the scientific and technological level of their time. There is a saying that the Mayan civilization may have some connection with extraterrestrial civilizations, and their knowledge may come from extraterrestrial visitors. The Mayans formulated the Tzolk'in calendar with a year of 260 days, which has nothing to do with the Earth's revolution cycle but has a mysterious connection with the orbits of celestial bodies such as Venus. They could accurately calculate the time of solar and lunar eclipses and the synodic period of Venus. Their writing is complex, and many of them have not been deciphered. The Pyramid of Kukulkan in Chichen Itza has unique light and shadow effects on the spring and autumn equinoxes, and they also left behind mysterious prophecies such as the end of the world prophecy, which has triggered endless speculation. Inca civilization. In the 8th century BC, the Inca civilization thrived in the mountains of the Andes. The Incas established a vast empire and were good at building roads and terraced fields to adapt to the mountainous geographical environment. The Inca civilization had no writing and used a quipu system to record information. The Incas achieved remarkable results in agriculture, architecture, and handicrafts. In some ancient legends of the Incas, there are mentions of messengers from the sky who brought advanced knowledge and technology to help the Incas develop their civilization, which has triggered speculation about the relationship between extraterrestrial civilizations and the Inca civilization. The stone buildings of the Inca civilization are amazing. For example, the ancient city of Machu Picchu is built of huge stones with high cutting precision. The stones are closely joined without adhesives. It remains an unsolved mystery how the Incas mined, transported, and joined these huge stones without modern mechanical tools. The coding method and recorded content of their quipu system have not been fully deciphered. It is said that a large amount of Inca gold treasures mysteriously disappeared after the invasion of the Spanish conquistadors. Indian civilization. Indian civilization began to take shape between 1500 to 1200 BC. After the Aryans invaded India, they brought new cultures and religions, which integrated with the local culture and gradually formed a rich and unique cultural tradition. The birth of Hinduism and Buddhism had a profound impact on the development of world religions and philosophy. The caste system in India had a profound impact on the social structure and people's lives and history. Although it has been abolished, its traces still remain in some aspects of Indian society. In some ancient Indian literature, there are records of vimanas, which are described as a kind of flying vehicle, like Tool. This has triggered speculation about whether there was contact between ancient Indian civilization and extraterrestrial civilizations. From these key time nodes and historical events, it can be clearly seen that the origin time spans of various civilizations are extremely large, and they are intertwined and influenced each other in the development process. The Mesopotamian civilization and the Egyptian civilization originated at similar times. In the early days, through trade, cultural exchanges, etc., they shared technologies, knowledge, and cultures, jointly promoting the progress of human civilization. The Greek and Roman civilizations developed relatively later and widely absorbed the essence of previous civilizations in their development process. This time difference and regional exchanges are not only closely related to various factors such as the unique geographical environment, rich resource conditions, and population migrations of each region, but also create opportunities for exchanges and integrations between civilizations, further increasing the difficulty of determining an accurate time sequence. Having understood the origin of civilizations, I believe you must be very curious about how these civilizations developed and grew step by step in the long river of history. Next, let's enter the development of civilization, driven by key events. The development of civilization, driven by key events. Many major civilizations originated intensively between 3000 to 2000 BC. around 2000 BC can be regarded as a crucial turning point in the development of human civilization. A series of far-reaching major events broke out intensively during this period, becoming a powerful driving force for the development of civilization. The widespread use of bronze. Bronze is made of an alloy of copper and tin. Compared with stone tools and pure copper utensils, it has higher hardness and sharpness and can be used to make more sophisticated tools and weapons. In the Mesopotamian civilization, the application of bronze farm tools greatly improved agricultural production efficiency, providing a solid material guarantee for the rise of cities and the growth of the population. Bronze weapons completely changed the pattern of war and enhanced the strength of the country. The widespread use of bronze in the Mesopotamian civilization was also spread to surrounding civilizations through trade and cultural exchanges. For example, after the Egyptian civilization came into contact with bronze technology, its metal processing technology was significantly improved. The birth of writing. Writing, as a symbol system for recording language and information, has higher precision and complexity compared with previous pictures and simple symbols. It can more accurately record human thoughts, experiences, and knowledge. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics were not only used to record daily affairs and religious ceremonies, but also engraved on the walls of temples and pyramids, becoming an important carrier for inheriting civilization. The emergence of writing greatly promoted the inheritance and innovation of culture. It also provided convenience for the signing of contracts and trade activities and the communication of government orders in urban management, promoting the development of cities and the standardization of trade, making the organization and management of human society more efficient. The emergence of cities. With the continuous development of social productivity and the gradual aggregation of the population, cities emerged. The emergence of cities is an important symbol of the development of civilization, embodying the achievements of humans in economy, politics, and culture. Taking the capital Yin of the Shang dynasty in ancient China as an example, its palaces, residential areas, and handicraft workshop areas are reasonably arranged with clear functional divisions. The perfect drainage system fully reflects the scientific nature of urban planning at that time. The emergence of cities made the population more concentrated and the social division of labor more refined, promoting the specialized and diversified development of the economy, greatly promoting economic prosperity. At the same time, cities also became political centers, promoting political centralization and providing a broader space for the progress of civilization. The development of trade. The development of trade broke the traditional self-sufficient economic model, making human economic activities more diversified. During the Roman Empire, the trade network spread throughout the Mediterranean region and extended to the distant east. Rome imported luxury goods such as silk, spices, and jewels from the east and exported characteristic products such as wine, olive oil, and pottery. The prosperity of trade not only increased the accumulation of wealth, but also promoted exchanges and integrations between different civilizations, accelerating the spread and development of civilization. These major events did not occur in isolation but promoted and complemented each other. The use of bronze improved productivity, laying a material foundation for the development of cities and the prosperity of trade. The emergence of writing facilitated trade exchanges and urban management, promoting the inheritance and development of culture. The development of cities further promoted the progress of trade and culture, providing a broader space for the production of bronze and the application of writing. The prosperity of trade provided economic support for the spread of bronze, the exchange of writing, and the development of cities. Together, they formed an organic whole, pushing human civilization into a new stage. As civilizations continue to develop, they gradually form their own unique characteristics. So, what specific aspects do these characteristics include? Next, let's explore characteristics of civilization. The integration of diverse elements together. Characteristics of civilization. The integration of diverse elements. Ancient civilizations usually possess the following remarkable characteristics. These characteristics are interrelated and influence each other, jointly constituting the colorful appearance of ancient civilizations. Cities and agriculture. Cities, as an important symbol of civilization, bear the important functions of population aggregation, economic prosperity, and cultural inheritance. Agriculture, on the other hand, is the foundation of the development of civilization, providing the necessary material support for the development of cities. In the Indus Valley Civilization, the city of Mohenjo-Daro has a rigorous layout, with streets arranged in a regular grid pattern and a complete water supply and drainage system. The fertile farmland around it grows crops such as wheat and barley, providing a solid material foundation for the prosperity and development of the city. The development of agriculture increases food production, enabling more non-agricultural people to be fed. These people can engage in commerce, handicrafts, religion, etc., further promoting the diversified development of the city. In turn, The development of the city provides technical support and market demand for agriculture, promoting the improvement of agricultural technology and the circulation of agricultural products. Writing and law. The emergence of writing enables human knowledge to be recorded and inherited more accurately, breaking through the limitations of time and space. Law, on the other hand, regulates social order and ensures social fairness and justice. The Code of Hammurabi in the Mesopotamian civilization is the first relatively complete written code in the world. It clarifies the rules and aspects such as commercial transactions, marriage and family, property inheritance, and criminal punishment, maintaining social fairness, justice, and economic order, and providing an important reference example for the construction of later legal systems. Writing can accurately record legal provisions, facilitating their dissemination and implementation, ensuring the authority and stability of the law. The formulation and implementation of the law also rely on writing to record cases and interpret clauses, promoting the development of legal culture. At the same time, the legal cases and provisions recorded in writing also become important materials for later generations to study the social structure and values of ancient times. Religion and art. Religion, as the sustenance of the human spiritual world, gives people spiritual comfort and the power of belief. Art, on the other hand, demonstrates human creativity and aesthetic pursuit. The Egyptian civilization is famous for its unique architecture, such as the magnificent pyramids and solemn temples. These buildings are not only symbols of religion and power, but also have a profound impact on later civilizations with their exquisite construction techniques and unique design concepts. In the process of the development of Greek architecture, it drew rich inspiration from Egyptian architecture. The ingenious use of huge stones and precise geometric structures in Egyptian architecture inspired Greek architects to innovate in columnar architecture. The Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders in Greece each have their own characteristics. The Doric order is simple and robust, embodying the masculine beauty. The Ionic order is elegant and slender, full of feminine softness. The Corinthian order is more gorgeous and complex, with stronger decoration. These orders are not only applied to temple buildings, but also widely used in other public buildings, becoming an important symbol of Greek architecture. This influence is not only reflected in the appearance of the architecture, but also runs through the development context of architectural aesthetics. Religion provides rich themes and connotations for artistic creation, and art, through various forms, makes religious beliefs concrete, making abstract religious concepts easier for the public to understand and accept. The two promote each other and jointly enrich the spiritual and cultural life of humans. Politics and military. A mature political system ensures the stable development of society. Rulers effectively manage and govern society by establishing political power institutions and formulating policies and regulations. A strong military force safeguards the security and independence of civilization, resisting external aggression and threats. The Roman Empire established a complete administrative system. From the central to the local level, official positions were clearly divided with clear responsibilities. The central government had official positions such as the Senate, consuls, and tribunes, responsible for national political decision-making and administrative management. Locally, it was divided into provinces, managed by governors. The Roman legion was well-disciplined, well-equipped, and adopted advanced tactics, such as the famous testudo formation. In battle, soldiers closely arranged their shields to form a solid defensive formation, which could effectively resist enemy attacks and carry out orderly offensives. The political system and military strategy of the Roman civilization have had a profound impact on the political construction and military development of later countries. Many countries have drawn on the valuable experience of Rome in administrative region division and military strategy formulation. A stable political environment provides a guarantee for the development of military power. Adequate resources and a stable social order can support the research and development of military equipment and the training of the military. In turn, a strong military force can maintain political rule, ensure national territorial integrity, and create a safe external environment for the implementation and improvement of the political system. These characteristics are interdependent and mutually promoting, jointly constituting the organic whole of ancient civilizations. The development of cities depends on the support of agriculture, and agriculture provides the material basis and labor force for cities. Writing and law provide guarantees for urban management and social order, enabling cities to operate in an orderly manner. Religion and art enrich people's spiritual lives and enhance social cohesion. Politics and the military maintain the stability and development of the country, creating a good environment for the development of other aspects. Since civilizations have their own unique development trajectories and distinct characteristics, have these ancient civilizations continued to this day after the vicissitudes of time? With this question in mind, let's enter the inheritance of civilization. The interweaving of continuity and change. The inheritance of civilization. The interweaving of continuity and change. Have these ancient civilizations continued to this day? Due to the different origins and development processes of different civilizations, their influences and legacies also vary significantly. To judge whether a civilization has continued, it can be considered from multiple dimensions such as geographical scope, language and writing, cultural traditions, religious philosophy, and scientific and technological innovation. Chinese civilization. As one of the oldest civilizations in the world, Chinese civilization started from the Xia dynasty around 2000 BC. After multiple dynasties, the geographical scope has remained relatively stable for a long time. Although the language and writing have evolved, from oracle bone inscriptions to bronze inscriptions, seal scripts, official scripts, and regular scripts, the form of Chinese characters has changed a lot, but Chinese characters have always been the core carrier of cultural inheritance, carrying the wisdom and memory of the Chinese nation for thousands of years. The benevolence and rights and righteousness advocated by Confucianism and the conformity to nature pursued by Taoism have become important parts of the values and behavioral norms of the Chinese people. Traditional festivals such as the Spring Festival and the Mid-Autumn Festival, carrying deep national emotions such as reunion and gratitude, are passed down from generation to generation and have become important components of the Chinese national cultural gene. In the field of science and technology, great inventions such as papermaking, gunpowder, the compass, and printing not only had a profound impact on China's own development, but also spread to all parts of the world through trade routes such as the Silk Road, revolutionarily promoting the development process of world civilization. Today, Confucius institutes around the world actively spread the Chinese language and culture. Traditional Chinese medicine, with its unique theoretical system and treatment methods, still safeguards people's health, inheriting the wisdom of ancient Chinese medical civilization. There are also those ancient traditional handicrafts such as paper, cutting, embroidery, and ceramic production, which still exude a unique charm in modern society, becoming a cultural link connecting the past and the present. Indian civilization. Indian civilization also has a long history, originating in the Indus River Valley around 2500 BC. The birth of Hinduism and Buddhism has had a profound impact on the development of world religions and philosophy. Although the caste system in Hinduism has been abolished, it had a profound impact on the social structure and people's lives and history, and its concepts still leave traces in some aspects of Indian society. India has a rich variety of art forms, and dance, music, sculpture, etc. all have unique styles and profound cultural connotations. Indian classical dance vividly interprets religious stories and emotions through rich gestures and flexible dance postures, inheriting India's cultural traditions. In modern India, religious festivals such as Shivaratri and Diwali are still lively. People continue the ancient beliefs and cultures through traditional celebration methods. Bollywood movies often incorporate elements of Indian traditional music and dance, spreading Indian culture around the world and becoming a beautiful business card of Indian culture. Egyptian civilization. Egyptian civilization emerged in the Nile River Valley around 300 BC and is famous for its pyramids, mummies, pharaohs, etc. However, with the conquest of the Roman Empire, the Arab Empire, the Ottoman Empire, etc., its geographical scope was occupied, its language and writing were replaced by Greek and Arabic, its cultural traditions were deeply influenced by Christianity and Islam, its religious philosophy was negated by monotheism, and its science and technology and innovation gradually lagged behind. Even so, the ruins and art of Egyptian civilization are still treasures of human civilization. Although Egyptian hieroglyphics are no longer used in daily life, they are of great significance to modern linguistic research. Scholars can deeply understand the social structure, religious beliefs, and daily life of ancient Egypt by interpreting hieroglyphics, providing precious materials for the study of the history of human civilization. In addition, the artistic style of Egypt, such as the unique way of depicting human figures in murals, provides a rich source of inspiration for modern art creation. Many modern artists draw nutrients from Egyptian art and create excellent works that integrate ancient and modern styles. Modern Egyptians still hold activities related to ancient religious ceremonies in some traditional festivals. For example, during Coptic Christmas, people celebrate following ancient traditions, retaining some traces of ancient Egyptian civilization. Greek civilization. Greek civilization thrived in the Aegean region around 800 BC, known for its city, states, mythology, philosophy, drama, and the Olympic Games. However, the occupations by the Macedonian Empire, the Roman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire affected its language and writing under the influence of Latin and Turkish, changed its cultural traditions under the impact of Orthodoxy and Islam, replaced its religious philosophy with Christianity and Islam, and its science and technology and innovation were surpassed by other civilizations. Nevertheless, the thoughts and arts of Greek civilization, such as the philosophical thoughts of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, have had a profound impact on the development of Western philosophy. Greek drama, sculpture, and other art forms have also become important sources of Western art. In the modern Western education system, ancient Greek philosophy is an important research content. Many universities offer relevant courses to inherit and study the thoughts of ancient Greek philosophers. The drama festivals held in Greece every year still stage classic Greek plays, inheriting the drama culture of ancient Greece and allowing people to feel the unique charm of ancient Greek civilization. From the inheritance and changes of civilizations, it is not difficult to see the strong influence of ancient civilizations. So, in what other aspects does this influence specifically manifest? Next, let's appreciate the influence of civilization, the power across time and space. The influence of civilization, the power across time and space. The influence of ancient civilizations is profound and lasting, not only reflected in the direct inheritance of later civilizations, but also in the mutual exchanges and integrations between different civilizations. Take Egyptian civilization as an example. Its religious system has a unique influence. The polytheism and the emphasis on the afterlife in Egypt formed a complex and mysterious funerary culture. This culture not only deeply influenced the social life of Egypt itself, but also spread to the Mediterranean region through trade and cultural exchanges. During the development of Greek civilization, although it had its own mythological system, it was also influenced by Egyptian civilization to some extent in terms of funerary rituals and the understanding of the soul. For example, some regions in Greece began to pay attention to the decoration of tombs and burial objects, and this change was closely related to the spread of Egyptian funerary culture, fully demonstrating the mutual influence and integration of different civilizations in communication. The legal system of Mesopotamian civilization, especially the Code of Hammurabi, laid the foundation for the development of later legal systems. The principles of fairness and justice it established and the regulation of various social relations became important references for many countries to formulate laws. The four great inventions of China spread to the West through the Silk Road, having a huge promoting effect on the scientific and technological development and social changes in the West. The introduction of papermaking and printing promoted the spread of Western culture and the popularization of knowledge. Gunpowder changed the way of war and promoted the development of military technology. The compass provided key technical support for the rise of the shipping industry, opening the prelude to the age of exploration. The influence among these civilizations is not one way but intertwined and mutually promoting. Different civilizations learn from each other's strengths in communication and jointly promote the progress of human civilization. Studying the interrelationships between ancient civilizations will make us encounter more mysteries waiting to be revealed. For example, in the early days of the development of human civilization, regions were relatively isolated with little communication. However, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, and the Americas, the worship of gods emerged one after another. For example, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia had their own pantheon, and the Egyptians worshipped many deities such as the sun god Apollo and the god of the underworld Osiris. From the macroscopic perspective of historical theory construction, we can speculate that this coincidental phenomenon may not be accidental. One possibility is that there were some global and far-reaching events at that time, which led to similar spiritual needs and cognitions among humans in different regions. If there were more advanced civilizations, they might have influenced humans in some way. This influence may not be direct contact but through some special natural phenomena, such as astronomical wonders and geological changes. These phenomena were beyond the understanding of humans at that time, so they were interpreted by humans as the will or actions of gods, triggering the worship of gods. From the aspect of archaeological discoveries, although there is currently no conclusive evidence directly related to more advanced civilizations, there are some phenomena worthy of attention. In the ruins of many ancient civilizations, there are some architectural structures and symbols that are difficult to explain. For example, the construction technology of the Egyptian pyramids. Under the technical conditions at that time, how to accurately cut, transport, and stack huge stones remains an unsolved mystery. Some people speculate that this may be the result of technical guidance from more advanced civilizations, or some marks left by more advanced civilizations. And these, in the eyes of humans at that time, might be the manifestation of the power of gods, thus strengthening the worship of gods. Another example is the Nazca lines in South America. The huge ground patterns can only be seen in their entirety from high altitude. In ancient times without modern aircraft, the purpose and method of drawing these lines are full of mystery and may also be related to more advanced civilizations, triggering the awe and worship of gods among the local people. Imagine if humans today appeared in ancient Egypt 5,000 years ago, holding iPhones, descending from the sky, carrying various weapons, and wearing exquisite clothes. Wouldn't they be the gods in the minds of people in ancient times? So, the possibility of the existence of higher wisdom and life cannot be excluded. However, we cannot firmly believe that this is a cognitive expression of more advanced civilization phenomena just based on these phenomena. There are still many unknowns and uncertainties in historical research and archaeological discoveries. Cultural backgrounds, natural environments, and other factors in different regions may also independently prompt humans to develop the worship of gods. For example, in the face of natural disasters, diseases, and other phenomena that cannot be explained and controlled, humans, out of fear of the unknown and the desire for supernatural powers, naturally developed religions and the worship of gods. This is a manifestation of the development of the human spiritual world and may not necessarily be related to more advanced civilizations. Therefore, the almost simultaneous emergence of the worship of gods by humans in different regions thousands of years ago may be a simple cognitive expression of more advanced civilization phenomena, but current historical research and archaeological discoveries are not sufficient to confirm this view. More exploration and research are needed to further analyze this mysterious phenomenon. Having reviewed the origin, development, characteristics, inheritance, and influence of ancient civilizations, what expectations do we have for the inheritance and development of future civilizations? Looking to the future, the inheritance and development of civilization. In today's globalized world, the connections between countries and ethnic groups are becoming increasingly close, and the exchanges and integrations between civilizations are more frequent. We should cherish the precious legacies left by these ancient civilizations, deeply study and inherit their essences, and let the ancient civilizations shine with new vitality in modern society. On the one hand, we can use modern technological means, such as digital technology, to comprehensively record and protect ancient civilization ruins, allowing more people to experience the charm of ancient civilizations in a virtual way. On the other hand, in the field of education, we can strengthen the research and teaching of ancient civilizations, cultivate more professionals with in-depth knowledge of ancient civilizations, and let the ancient wisdom be inherited and applied in modern society. In the next few episodes of the program, we will start from the Mesopotamian civilization and successively introduce in depth the Egyptian civilization, Chinese civilization, Indus Valley civilization, Greek civilization, Roman civilization, Mayan civilization, and Inca civilization. We will explore their origins, developments, characteristics, contributions, declines, and mutual influences. Through comparative analysis, we hope to enable you to understand and recognize human history and culture more comprehensively and deeply. Civilization is the commonwealth of humanity and our common responsibility. We should respect and protect every civilization and promote its continuous development, allowing the light of civilization to lead us to a better future. Whether it is an ancient traditional festival, a precious historical relic, or a profound ideological culture, they are all treasures of human civilization. Let us work together to inherit and carry forward these civilizations, making them shine forever in the long river of history. Dear viewers, thank you all for watching and your company. I'm Lawrence Stardust, your navigator on this journey through time and space. Learning from people can help us understand our gains and losses, and learning from history can help us understand the rise and fall of nations. Let's explore the unsolved mysteries of history together. If you like this video, welcome to like, comment with your views, and follow our channel. More exciting content is coming up. See you next time.